It takes money to eliminate bad actors. That was the exact justification used by United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on March 19, 2026, when he stood before the press to defend a sudden off-the-books request for $200 billion in SECT, emergency supplemental military funding. Let that staggering number sink into your mind for a moment. $200 billion. To put the sheer gravity of that figure into perspective, consider that the United States spent roughly $65 billion in security assistance to Ukraine over a span of more than 2 years. Now the Pentagon is asking Congress for more than 3 times that entire amount for a military campaign in Iran that is barely 3 weeks old. Welcome to Prism News. I am your host, and today we are untangling the greatest macroeconomic and geopolitical paradox of our modern era. Right now, we are witnessing a monumental collision of policies in Washington that directly threatens the purchasing power of every American citizen. On one side of the political spectrum, you have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy leading the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency, widely known as DOGE. Their publicly stated mandate is to ruthlessly hunt down bureaucratic waste and slash up to $2 trillion from the federal budget. They have audited federal grants, terminated massive consulting contracts, and demanded maximum transparency for every single taxpayer dime. They are promising the ultimate era of domestic austerity. But look at the other side of the Potomac River. The military-industrial complex is operating under a completely different set of rules. Lawmakers were quietly briefed that just the first 6 days of the current conflict cost American taxpayers more than $11.3 billion. We are looking at a systemic and undeniable contradiction. How does a government successfully execute the most aggressive domestic cost-cutting program in modern history while simultaneously funding a new open-ended military operation in the Middle East? You cannot slash the federal deficit when you are burning through over $1 billion a day in combat operations. This is not just a story about foreign policy or distant conflicts. It is a story about your wallet, your savings, and the structural instability of the American economy. To understand why the Pentagon is burning through cash at this unprecedented velocity, we must dissect the anatomy of the current military campaign officially designated as Operation Epic Fury. Launched on February 28, 2026, this represents the most intensive strategic aerial campaign the United States has executed since the 1991 Gulf War. The stated objectives are absolute and uncompromising. The mission aims to completely dismantle the Iranian ballistic missile arsenal, annihilate their naval infrastructure, and permanently deny them the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. But precision destruction at this massive scale requires the most expensive and sophisticated hardware on the planet. Consider the precedent that was set in June 2025 during Operation Midnight Hammer. In that specific mission, the United States Air Force deployed 7 B-2 stealth bombers halfway across the globe. Each B-2 Spirit bomber is a $2 billion flying supercomputer. During that strike, they dropped 14 massive ordnance penetrators, known as the GBU-57. Each of these specialized bunker buster munitions weighs 30,000 pounds and is packed with nearly 26,000 pounds of high-grade steel designed to crush through 200 feet of solid mountain rock. The operational cost of putting those stealth bombers in the air, coordinating dozens of aerial refueling tankers and launching waves of Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles from submarines in the Arabian Sea, is astronomically high. Every single Tomahawk missile fired carries a price tag of approximately $2 million. During Operation Epic Fury, the United States military, alongside allied forces, has reportedly struck over 7,000 targets, including deeply buried missile storage facilities and coastal defense systems. The intelligence is highly refined and the targeting is surgical, but the financial burn rate of these munitions is entirely unsustainable without a massive influx of new capital. The defense industrial base must manufacture replacements for every $2 million missile and every customized penetrator bomb being deployed. When Secretary Hegseth states that the campaign is ahead of schedule, he is speaking strictly in military terms. But financially, that schedule is entirely dependent on whether Congress is willing to approve that $200 billion blank check. This leads us directly into the inevitable clash between the Pentagon and the Department of Government Efficiency. Musk and Ramaswamy originally targeted $2 trillion in cuts, but have since faced the harsh realities of the federal system, paring their immediate focus down to $500 billion in unauthorized annual expenditures. They are scrutinizing everything from veterans, healthcare, and opioid treatment grants to housing assistance and the Department of Education. They intend to streamline the bureaucracy by July 4, 2026, to present a leaner government for the 250th anniversary of America. But here is the critical twist that mainstream financial analysts are largely ignoring. The discretionary budget includes almost everything the federal government does, except for mandatory entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security. And the Pentagon accounts for more than half of that entire discretionary spending pie. You simply cannot cut trillions or even hundreds of billions from the federal budget without touching the military. It is mathematically impossible. The irony of the situation is staggering. While efficiency analysts are terminating consulting contracts to save $12 billion over a year, the Pentagon spends nearly that exact same amount in less than a week of active combat in the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, critics are pointing out the inherent conflicts of interest at play. Companies tied to the efficiency leadership hold billions of dollars in government defense and aerospace contracts including satellite launches crucial for military communications. Can a commission effectively audit the military-industrial complex while simultaneously operating within the very defense sector that is currently seeing its budget skyrocket due to Operation Epic Fury? This is the ultimate friction point. Conservative fiscal hawks, who desperately want to balance the budget, are colliding head-on with national security hawks, who demand overwhelming military supremacy regardless of the cost. The result is a domestic policy illusion where citizens feel the pain of cutbacks, while the national debt continues to expand rapidly to fund overseas operations. While politicians argue over supplementary budgets in Washington, the real economic shockwave is rippling outward from a narrow stretch of water, 21 miles wide, known as the Strait of Hormuz. In normal times, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum liquids pass through this critical choke point every single day. That represents 20% of global petroleum consumption and a massive chunk of the world liquefied natural gas trade. Today, that vital flow has been reduced to a mere trickle. Shipping traffic has collapsed by nearly 90% since the conflict began. Why has this happened? Because the waters are actively contested and highly dangerous. The United States military claims to have eliminated 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels, but the threat of asymmetric naval warfare remains severe. Adversaries have deployed swarms of fast attack boats and older contact mines that drift unpredictably in the circular currents of the Gulf of Oman. For the maritime insurance industry operating in hubs like Lloyd's of London, this situation has created an absolute logistical nightmare. War premiums to insure a commercial vessel used to be a tiny fraction of a percent of the total hull value. Today, those premiums have surged dramatically to between 1% and 3%. And that premium only applies if the insurer can actually track the ship. To avoid being targeted, dozens of vessels are going dark by turning off their automated identification system transponders. Others are utilizing spoofing tactics, altering their digital signatures to appear as Chinese vessels on radar screens. Because insurance companies cannot verify exactly where these shadow tankers are navigating, they are forced to rely on expensive satellite imagery and synthetic aperture radar just to underwrite a policy. The overall result is a state of total maritime paralysis. Over 150 massive oil tankers are anchored outside the strait, unable to safely load or depart. This is not merely a regional dispute over territorial waters. This is a deliberate and effective strangulation of the central artery of the global economy. The geographical consequences of this supply shock are vast, and they dictate the economic clock of this conflict. The burden of the Strait of Hormuz closure is highly uneven across the globe. 84% of the crude oil and condensate moving through that strait is destined for Asian markets. This means the greatest direct exposure lies with major economies like China, India, Japan, and South Korea. India, for example, relied on the strait for millions of barrels daily to power its refineries and fuel its massive economic growth. With 90% of India imported liquefied petroleum gas flowing through Hormuz, the blockade threatens the daily lives of hundreds of millions of households dependent on subsidized cooking gas. To manage this sudden evaporation of supply, the International Energy Agency launched the largest emergency reserve release in its history. On March 11, 2026, member countries agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil into the global market. In parallel, the United States authorized the release of 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But here is the critical insight you need to understand. Strategic reserves are a temporary bridge, not a permanent solution. If you take the baseline of 20 million barrels per day, normally flowing through Hormuz, and subtract the small amount that can be bypassed through Saudi and Emirati pipelines, the world is still facing a net shortfall of roughly 15 million barrels every single day. At that tremendous burn rate, the combined global emergency stocks only provide a buffer of about 70 to 80 days. We are operating on borrowed time. Once those reserves begin to deplete visibly, the market psychology will shift from apprehension to outright panic. The vulnerability of these Asian markets forces a rapid restructuring of global trade as countries frantically bid against each other for secure Atlantic basin supplies, driving up costs across the entire supply chain. Now, you might be asking yourself a very logical question regarding this crisis. The United States is currently the largest oil producer in the world. We pump out over 13 million barrels of crude every single day, surpassing both Saudi Arabia and Russia. So, if we possess energy dominance, why did the national average for a gallon of regular gasoline jump by nearly 70 cents in a matter of weeks, reaching $3.84 a gallon, with diesel surging over $5? The answer lies in the American energy paradox. It is a structural mismatch hidden deep within our national refining infrastructure. Yes, we produce record amounts of oil, thanks to the incredible shale revolution in places like the Permian Basin in Texas. But the crude oil we extract from the ground is predominantly light and sweet. It is thin, low in sulfur, and relatively easy to refine. However, the vast majority of our massive refinery complexes, located along the United States Gulf Coast, were built several decades ago. They were designed and optimized through billions of dollars of investments to process heavy, sour crude oil imported from places like Venezuela, Mexico, and the Middle East. Heavy crude is thick, highly viscous, and full of sulfur impurities. Our refineries are the absolute best in the world at cracking down this cheap, dirty crude into high-value products like diesel, jet fuel, and asphalt. Because our domestic refineries cannot efficiently process all the light sweet oil we produce, we are forced to export about 4 million barrels of our own high-quality crude every day, mostly to buyers in Europe and Asia. In return, we must import around 8 million barrels of heavy crude to properly feed our domestic refineries. Therefore, the United States is securely locked into a globally interconnected commodity market. When the Strait of Hormuz chokes off the global supply of medium and heavy, crude foreign buyers scramble and bid up the price of oil everywhere. American consumers ultimately pay that elevated global price at the pump, regardless of how much light sweet crude is sitting right beneath Texas. In a desperate attempt to combat these surging fuel prices and offer relief to American consumers, the White House took emergency executive action on March 18, 2026. President Trump issued a 60-day waiver of the Jones Act. The Jones Act, formerly known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is a century-old maritime law that mandates any cargo shipped between two United States ports must be carried on vessels that are built, crewed, and flagged by American citizens. The stated logic behind the waiver appears straightforward on the surface. By temporarily suspending these strict rules, the government allows cheaper foreign-flagged vessels to transport oil and natural gas from the Gulf Coast refineries directly to the East Coast, alleviating regional price shocks. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt framed the decision as a vital step to mitigate short-term disruptions while the military continues meeting the objectives of Operation Epic Fury. But industry experts and supply chain analysts are calling this waiver a mere placebo. While waiving the Jones Act makes it slightly easier and moderately cheaper to move oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to domestic ports, it does absolutely nothing to lower the fundamental global price of crude oil, which ultimately dictates the price of gasoline. The American Maritime Partnership, an industry coalition, noted that domestic shipping costs account for less than 1 penny per gallon of the final price you pay at the pump. The waiver is essentially political theater. It provides the appearance of decisive executive action to help the working class while distracting from the harsh reality that the United States remains structurally vulnerable to global commodity shocks. You cannot legislate or waive away a global supply deficit. As long as the heavy crude imports we rely on are subjected to the risk premiums of a Middle Eastern conflict, the American consumer will continue to shoulder the financial burden at the gas station. The ripple effects of this profound supply deficit become truly terrifying when you examine the macroeconomic math. This is where we transition from localized pain at the fuel pump to a synchronized global economic crisis. The International Monetary Fund has been monitoring the Middle East with grave concern. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva delivered a blunt and sobering warning during a symposium in Tokyo. The mathematical formula they utilize is simple but devastating for global markets. According to IMF, economic models, every 10% increase in the price of oil that persists for a year pushes global headline inflation up by 40 basis points and simultaneously reduces global economic growth by 0.1 to 0.2%. Following the launch of Epic Fury and the subsequent shipping blockade, Brent crude prices shot up by nearly 25%, trading briefly near $120 a barrel. Financial institutions like Barclays and Goldman Sachs have warned that a fully fleshed out protracted conflict could push prices to an unprecedented $150 a barrel. If oil settles and remains stubbornly above $100 a barrel, economists calculate, it would add nearly a full percentage point to headline inflation, pushing it back above 3.5% in the United States. This dynamic threatens to wipe out years of painful economic recovery. And remember, this is not just about the cost of gasoline for your commute. Energy costs are deeply embedded in every single step of the global supply chain. Higher fuel costs immediately translate into higher maritime freight rates. Elevated natural gas prices mean vastly more expensive fertilizer, which directly drives up the cost of cultivating essential crops like corn, wheat, and rice. We are watching a severe energy shock rapidly mutate into a pervasive food inflation shock. This cascading inflation dynamic brings us to the ultimate trap. The Federal Reserve is now boxed into a corner with no safe exit strategy. Just weeks before the military conflict broke out, financial markets were optimistically pricing in a slow, steady series of interest rate cuts. Inflation was supposedly drifting downward toward the target rate of 2%, and a soft landing appeared achievable. But the war has completely scrambled the entire monetary policy playbook. In mid-March 2026, the Federal Reserve voted to hold interest rates steady at 3.5 to 3.75%. During his highly anticipated press conference, Chairman Jerome Powell admitted the central bank is facing massive, unpredictable uncertainty. When directly asked about the economic effects of the ongoing war, Powell bluntly stated that nobody knows. The legally mandated dual mission of the Federal Reserve, which is keeping prices stable while maximizing employment, has now become a dueling mandate. If the Fed chooses to cut interest rates to stimulate a softening labor market and help financially stressed consumers, they risk pouring monetary gasoline on the inflationary fire sparked by the oil shock. But if they raise interest rates to aggressively crush this new wave of energy-driven inflation, they risk triggering a severe recession, just as borrowing costs for the federal government are already exploding to fund the war. This scenario is the textbook definition of stagflation. It is the simultaneous occurrence of rising prices and slowing economic growth. The bond market has already reacted sharply, pricing in the geopolitical volatility and pushing the 10-year Treasury yield higher. Consequently, mortgage rates have climbed back over 6%, once again crushing housing affordability for the average American family. The Federal Reserve is essentially paralyzed, forced to wait and watch as military decisions made thousands of miles away dictate the purchasing power of the American dollar. To fully grasp why this geopolitical conflict is so exceptionally difficult to resolve quickly, we have to examine the brutal and unforgiving economics of asymmetric warfare. Iran does not possess a highly sophisticated conventional air force. They do not operate fleets of fifth-generation stealth fighters. However, they do possess the most diverse and voluminous ballistic missile and drone arsenal in the entire region. Let us break down the staggering disparity in the cost-benefit ratio. The adversary relies heavily on systems like the Shahed 136 loitering munition. This is a highly rudimentary weapon powered by a cheap two-stroke piston engine built utilizing commercially available dual-use components smuggled through various shell companies. It costs roughly $35,000 to manufacture one of these drones. Now look closely at how the United States and its regional allies defend against this specific threat. A single interceptor from a United States Patriot missile battery costs approximately $4 million. A THAAD missile interceptor costs an incredible $13 million. Even the short-range advanced air-to-air missiles fired from Allied fighter jets cost $250,000 each. You do not need a degree in advanced mathematics to realize that this is a rapidly losing equation. The United States cannot sustain a prolonged war of attrition where it costs 20 to 100 times more to shoot down a weapon than it costs the enemy to manufacture it. The supply of multi-million-dollar precision interceptors is finite, and the industrial production timelines take years, not weeks. This exact economic vulnerability is why the Pentagon is currently consulting with Ukrainian Special Forces commanders who have spent years combating these exact same drone systems. The Ukrainians successfully developed high-speed first-person view interceptor drones that cost a tiny fraction of traditional air defense missiles. Until the United States military can rapidly scale a cheap, effective countermeasure, the financial bleeding in the Middle East will continue to drain the defense budget, rendering any domestic cost-cutting measures completely irrelevant. While the eyes of the global media remain fiercely fixated on the Persian Gulf, a massive and highly consequential geopolitical realignment is quietly taking place in our own backyard. Major military actions are rarely isolated events. Concurrently with the Middle Eastern conflict, the current administration executed a daring special operations raid in Caracas, Venezuela, successfully capturing President Nicolas Maduro. This specific operation signaled the activation of what geopolitical analysts are calling the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. It is a calculated strategic pivot designed to secure the Western Hemisphere against the rapidly growing influence of extra-hemispheric powers, namely China and Russia. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. More importantly, those reserves consist primarily of the exact heavy sour crude that the United States Gulf Coast refineries are desperately engineered to process. By neutralizing the hostile regime in Caracas, the United States is actively attempting to secure a massive, reliable, heavy crude supply chain directly south of its borders, radically reducing future vulnerability to Middle Eastern oil. Shocks. This renewed doctrine extends far beyond South America. It provides context for the renewed strategic interest in securing critical mineral deposits in Greenland and asserting firmer dominance over the Panama Canal, where Chinese state-backed companies currently operate key logistical hubs. As global trade fractures away from the open and free markets of the past 3 decades, we are entering a new era of regional economic fortresses. Nations are brutally realizing that extended supply chains stretched across hostile oceans represent a critical national security vulnerability. The decisive action in Venezuela was not merely about promoting human rights or restoring democracy. It was a highly calculated move in a grand global chess game of resource monopoly and supply chain sovereignty. So what does this complex web of military strategy and macroeconomic data mean for the future of investment and global capital? When the world transitions from an era of general uncertainty to an era of profound structural instability, the smart money moves rapidly and decisively. We are currently witnessing a massive historical flow of capital into what experts define as hard assets and economic security themes. Because the Strait of Hormuz crisis unequivocally proved that vital physical supply chains can be choked off overnight, governments and multinational corporations are aggressively prioritizing resilience over pure efficiency. This paradigm shift means reshoring critical manufacturing capabilities back to North America, regardless of the increased labor costs. It means unprecedented, heavy investments in the domestic electrical grid to support the massive energy demands of artificial intelligence data centers while securing the power supply from cyber threats. It also absolutely guarantees that global defense spending will continue to rise exponentially regardless of what domestic efficiency commissions attempt to achieve. Cybersecurity firms, critical mineral mining operations, and domestic energy infrastructure companies are rapidly becoming the new foundational blue-chip investments. Sophisticated investors are completely abandoning the naive illusion that geopolitical peace and open trade are the default states of the world. They are actively positioning their portfolios for a deeply fragmented multipolar reality, where direct access to secure energy and highly protected borders dictate national and corporate survival. The illusion of a quick surgical victory in the Middle East has evaporated. The American consumer is now the ultimate shock absorber for decades of outdated refinery, infrastructure policy failures, and geopolitical miscalculations. Do not let the daily political theater distract you from the unforgiving macroeconomic math. The massive bill for these global operations is coming due, and it is the taxpayer who will ultimately pay the price through the invisible and insidious tax of persistent inflation. Stay vigilant, question the prevailing narratives, and always follow the money. I am your host for Prism News. Thank you for watching.